A millionaire decides to fire his maid because she's sick, but when his son accidentally falls into the pool, the maid doesn't hesitate. She risks her life to save the boy from drowning. In that moment, the millionaire finally understands what it truly means to care for someone. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Stay with us. The city skyline glittered in the morning light as Hugo Muller stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse office. At 53, Hugo had constructed his life with the same precision he demanded from the architects who designed his luxury properties across the country. Muller Developments was the crown jewel of his existence, a billion-dollar empire built through calculated decisions, ruthless negotiations, and an almost pathological need for control. "The Seaport portfolio analysis is ready, sir," said Vincent Hargrove, Hugo's executive assistant of 15 years. Vincent's voice barely rippled the silence of the pristine office. Hugo nodded without turning. "And the zoning variance?" "Approved this morning. The council voted 7-2 in our favor." A thin smile crossed Hugo's face. Another victory. Another piece perfectly positioned on his chessboard. "Schedule the contractor meeting for Thursday. I want the foundation poured before winter." The meticulously ordered desk behind him held exactly 3 items: a laptop with triple monitors displaying real-time market analytics, a single fountain pen inside a leather holder, and a silver frame containing a photograph of a woman with auburn hair and intelligent eyes, Diane, his wife, gone for 9 years now. "Will you be home for dinner with Peter tonight?" Vincent asked, knowing the answer before Hugo responded. "The Richardson investors are flying in. Have my driver bring me a change of clothes." Hugo finally turned from the window, his expression unchanged. "Tell Mrs. Alvarez to serve Peter's dinner at the usual time." Vincent nodded and departed silently. Hugo opened his calendar to find it partitioned into 15-minute increments, each block filled with meetings, calls, and decisions that would shape the fate of his company. 2 weeks ago, he'd added a recurring 30-minute block every Thursday. Peter, Academic Progress Review. The drive to his Beacon Hill mansion was silent. Hugo reviewed quarterly projections on his tablet as his car navigated through the city. The thought of his son barely penetrated his consciousness until the vehicle pulled through the ornate gates of the Muller estate. The mansion's Georgian architecture loomed imposingly against the approaching dusk. 4 stories of stone and privilege, surrounded by immaculate gardens and a security perimeter that kept the world firmly at bay. Inside, Mrs. Alvarez, his housekeeper, of 7 years, was helping Peter with his homework at the kitchen table. Her weathered hands guided his sons through algebra equations. At 16, Peter had his mother's auburn hair and keen intelligence, but none of Hugo's towering height. The wheelchair beside him was a constant reminder of what they had lost. "Mr. Muller," Mrs. Alvarez said, straightening as Hugo entered. At 55, Rosa Alvarez carried herself with quiet dignity despite the chronic cough that had plagued her for months. "I didn't expect you home so early." "The Richardson meeting was postponed," Hugo replied without elaboration. He eyed the kitchen's gleaming countertops, checking for imperfections in the immaculate space. "Peter, your tutor reported that your science project is behind schedule." Peter's fingers stilled on his textbook. "I've been working on it. Mrs. Alvarez helped me research the hydroponic system yesterday." Hugo's gaze flicked to Mrs. Alvarez. "That's not in your job description." "It was no trouble, sir," she said, a slight wheeze apparent in her voice. "Peter has such a curious mind." The softness in her tone when she spoke about his son triggered an inexplicable irritation in Hugo. He set his briefcase down with a sharp click. "Your primary responsibility is the maintenance of this house, Mrs. Alvarez. Peter has tutors for his academic needs." A heavy silence settled over the kitchen. Peter's shoulders hunched slightly, his gaze fixed on his textbook. "I understand, Mr. Muller," Mrs. Alvarez said, her voice steady despite the color rising in her cheeks. "Dinner will be ready in 20 minutes. Hugo nodded curtly and turned to his son. "I'll be in my study. We'll review your academic progress afterward." As he walked away, he heard Peter's quiet voice. "Thanks for helping me, Mrs. Alvarez. Your explanation makes a lot more sense than my teacher's. Hugo's study was a sanctuary of walnut paneling and leather-bound books. He loosened his tie and opened his laptop, immediately immersing himself in work. The household's silence was periodically broken by Mrs. Alvarez's coughing from somewhere downstairs. The sound grated on his nerves, reminding him of hospital waiting rooms and the powerlessness he'd felt as doctors had delivered their verdict on Diane. On Peter. An hour later, a knock at his study door announced dinner. Hugo found the dining table set with the precision he demanded. Silver polished, napkins pressed, water crystal clear in the goblets. Mrs. Alvarez had prepared Peter's favorite pasta primavera, though Hugo noticed she'd served herself nothing. "You're not eating?" he asked, more observation than concern. "I'll eat later, sir," she replied, pouring water for Peter. "I need to finish the laundry first." Hugo noticed the slight tremor in her hands, the pallor beneath her naturally olive complexion. She'd been coughing more frequently over the past weeks. He made a mental note to have Vincent check the employee health insurance policy. Sick employees were inefficient employees. During dinner, Peter talked about his online chess club and a new friend he'd made, another wheelchair user from Seattle who shared his interest in marine biology. Hugo listened with half his attention, the other half reviewing a mental checklist of tomorrow's meetings. "And Tyler said there's a competition for adaptive swimming next month in Providence. I thought maybe I could—" "Swimming?" Hugo's focus sharpened. "You haven't been in the pool since—" He stopped abruptly. Since the accident, since Diane had died and Peter's spine had been crushed, since Hugo had drained the indoor pool where Diane had taught Peter to swim, refilling it only years later as a decorative feature with ornamental koi. "I know," Peter said quietly, "but Tyler's been telling me about adaptive techniques. There are coaches who specialize in working with people like me." Mrs. Alvarez, who had returned to clear the plates, placed a gentle hand on Peter's shoulder. "I think it sounds wonderful, Peter." Hugo studied his son's face, the hopeful expression that appeared so rarely these days. Hope was dangerous. Hope led to disappointment. "We'll discuss it after I've researched these programs thoroughly." Peter's expression fell, but he nodded. Years of similar conversations had taught him not to push. After dinner, Hugo retreated to his study, losing himself in spreadsheets and projections until well past midnight. When he finally emerged, the house was dark except for a light in the kitchen. He found Mrs. Alvarez at the sink, a handkerchief pressed to her mouth as she fought a coughing fit. "You should have gone home hours ago," he said, startling her. "Mr. Muller," she gasped, quickly composing herself. "I was just finishing up." "Your health appears to be deteriorating," Hugo stated it as a clinical observation. "Have you consulted a doctor?" Mrs. Alvarez hesitated, folding the handkerchief carefully. "It's just a persistent infection. I'm on antibiotics." "How long?" 3 weeks now." She busied herself wiping the already spotless counter. "It's nothing serious." Hugo knew prevarication when he heard it. "Mrs. Alvarez, I rely on you to manage this household effectively. If your health is compromising your ability to work—" "It isn't," she said quickly. "I would never let it affect my work or Peter's care." Hugo noticed a pill bottle on the counter. Before Mrs. Alvarez could move it, he glimpsed the label. A powerful antibiotic, the kind prescribed for severe respiratory infections. "My grandson's treatment is progressing well," she continued, clearly trying to redirect the conversation. "The doctors in Arizona are optimistic. The specialist you recommended has made all the difference." Hugo recalled vaguely authorizing Vincent to provide a referral to a pediatric specialist for Mrs. Alvarez's grandson, a child with some rare blood disorder. It had been a simple matter of making a phone call, leveraging one of countless connections. "I'm glad to hear it," he said, the response automatic. He studied her face more carefully. The shadows under her eyes had deepened and her breathing seemed labored even at rest. Something uncomfortable stirred in his chest. "Get some rest, Mrs. Alvarez. Send Vincent your doctor's bills if they're excessive." Relief crossed her features. "Thank you, Mr. Muller. You're very kind." Kind was not a word often associated with Hugo Muller. The description unsettled him as he climbed the stairs to his bedroom. Kindness was inefficient, a luxury he'd abandoned along with so many others after losing Diane. As he passed Peter's room, he hesitated, then pushed the door open slightly. In the dim light, he could see his son sleeping, headphones still on, a book about marine biology open on his chest. For a moment, Hugo saw Diane in the curve of Peter's cheek, the fan of eyelashes against his skin. He closed the door quietly and continued to his own immaculate bedroom, where he slept, dreamlessly, until his alarm sounded at precisely 5 a.m. Another day of perfect control awaited. The first rays of dawn streaked across the sky as Rosa Alvarez waited at the bus stop 3 blocks from the Muller mansion. Her chest felt as though it were filled with shards of glass, each breath a careful negotiation. The doctor's words from yesterday's appointment echoed in her mind. This isn't responding to antibiotics anymore. You need aggressive treatment, rest, and hospitalization. But hospitals cost money, and money wasn't something Rosa had in abundance, not with Miguel's specialized treatments draining her savings. Her grandson's face flashed in her mind, his brave smile in their last video call from the Arizona Medical Center. No, she couldn't afford to be sick. Not now. The bus arrived with a pneumatic hiss, and Rosa boarded, clutching her purse tightly. Inside was her life's documentation. Medical reports, bills, and a photograph of Miguel standing before his illness had confined him to hospital beds. What would happen to him if she couldn't work? The thought sent a fresh wave of panic through her chest, triggering another coughing fit that had other passengers moving away. By the time she reached the Muller estate, Rosa had composed herself. She entered through the service entrance, moving quietly through the house's hushed opulence. In the kitchen, she began preparing breakfast: fresh fruit, organic yogurt, and whole-grain toast for Peter, black coffee and a protein shake for Mr. Muller. "Mrs. Alvarez?" Peter's voice came from the doorway. He wheeled himself into the kitchen, still in pajamas, his hair tousled from sleep. "You're here early." Rosa smiled, warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with fever. "Good morning, sunshine. I wanted to finish that science project with you before school." Peter's face brightened. At 16, he balanced precariously between boyhood and the man he was becoming. Brilliant but withdrawn, trapped in a body that had betrayed him, and a home that felt more like a museum than a sanctuary. "Dad said you shouldn't help me with schoolwork," he reminded her, though he was already pulling out the project materials they'd hidden in the pantry. "Your father doesn't need to know everything," Rosa winked, setting a glass of orange juice before him. "Besides, we're not doing your work for you. We're just exploring together." As they worked on the hydroponics system, Rosa marveled at Peter's intuitive understanding of the scientific principles involved. Like his father, he had a mind that dissected problems methodically. Unlike Hugo, however, Peter's approach was infused with genuine curiosity rather than cold calculation. "Mrs. Alvarez," Peter's voice grew serious as he adjusted a tube in the system, "is your grandson getting better?" Rosa hesitated. "The doctors are doing everything they can." "But is it working?" Peter persisted, his eyes, so like his mother's in the photographs, fixed on her face. "Dad never tells me the truth about medical stuff. I want to know the real answer." Rosa sighed, sitting down heavily at the kitchen table. "It's complicated, Carino. Miguel's condition is rare. The treatments help, but—" She trailed off, unwilling to burden Peter with the full weight of her fears. Peter nodded, understanding beyond his years. "That's why you keep working even when you're sick yourself." It wasn't a question. Before Rosa could respond, the kitchen door swung open. Hugo Muller stood there in his immaculate suit, expression unreadable, as he surveyed the science project spread across his pristine countertops. "Peter, your ride to school will be here in 15 minutes, he said, voice clipped. "Mrs. Alvarez, a word." Peter shot Rosa an apologetic glance as he gathered his materials and wheeled himself from the kitchen. The silence that followed was thick with tension. "I believe I made myself clear regarding your role in my son's education," Hugo said, pouring himself coffee without looking at her. "With all due respect, Mr. Muller," Rosa began, summoning what energy she had left. Peter enjoys the science projects. It gives him something. I employ specialized tutors for Peter's educational enrichment, Hugo cut in. Your sentimentality, while perhaps well-intentioned, undermines the structured approach to his development. Rosa felt heat rise in her cheeks. Children need more than structure, Mr. Muller. They need connection. Hugo's eyes narrowed slightly, the only indication that her words had penetrated. My son's emotional needs are not your concern. I've managed Peter's development successfully for 9 years without interference. Successfully. The word escaped before Rosa could stop it, charged with 9 years of watching Peter retreat further into himself. He barely smiles except when... A violent coughing fit interrupted her, doubling her over. She clutched. The counter for support, fighting for breath as her lungs rebelled. Through watering eyes, she saw Hugo step back, his expression shifting from annoyance to something closer to alarm. How long has your condition been this severe? He demanded when she could finally breathe again. Rosa straightened, dignity returning despite the handkerchief spotted with blood she quickly tucked away. It's nothing serious. Don't lie to me, Mrs. Alvarez. I detest inefficiency, and illness is the ultimate inefficiency. Hugo's voice was cold, but his eyes tracked her movements with calculating precision. What did your doctor say at your last appointment? Rosa hesitated. That I should rest. And yet you're here exposing my son to whatever infection you're harboring. Hugo set his coffee cup down with finality. This is unacceptable. Mr. Muller, please, Rosa began, desperation seeping into her voice. I need this job. My grandson... Your health presents a risk I'm not willing to take, Hugo interrupted. Peter's immune system has been compromised since the accident. I can't have you endangering him. The kitchen seemed to tilt beneath Rosa's feet. I would never endanger Peter. I care for him as if he were my own. That's precisely the problem. Hugo's voice was ice. He is not your son, Mrs. Alvarez. He is mine. He reached into his suit jacket and withdrew an envelope. 2-month severance. Your benefits will continue until the end of the quarter. I've arranged for a car service to take you home. Rosa stared at the envelope, unable to process what was happening. Mr. Muller, please reconsider. I've been with your family for 7 years, and I've compensated you fairly for that time. Hugo placed the envelope on the counter between them. This discussion is over. Please gather your belongings. Rosa felt as though she'd been struck. Through the window, she could see Peter being helped into the specialized van that would take him to his private school. He turned, catching sight of her in the kitchen window, and raised his hand in a small wave. She waved back, fighting tears. Vincent will escort you out, Hugo said, already turning his attention to his phone. I expect the transition to be quick and without disruption to the household. 20 minutes later, Rosa sat on the curb outside the Muller estate's imposing gates, the envelope clutched in her trembling hands. Her few possessions, a framed photo of Miguel, a cardigan she kept in the laundry room, a small collection of recipes, were stuffed into a paper bag beside her. Through her tears, she gazed back at the mansion. For 7 years, she had moved through those rooms, caring for a broken family that refused to acknowledge its brokenness. She had held Peter when nightmares of the accident woke him screaming. She had dusted the photograph of Diane that Hugo couldn't bear to look at directly, but couldn't bring himself to remove. And now, like a defective part in one of Hugo's precision machines, she had been replaced. The September sun beat down on her head as she waited for the car Hugo had grudgingly arranged. Her chest burned with each breath, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the thought of never seeing Peter again. Would the next housekeeper know that he liked the crusts cut off his sandwiches? Would they understand that his snappish moods weren't rudeness, but frustration at a body that had betrayed him? Would they sit with him on difficult anniversaries, when Hugo buried himself in work? A splashing sound from beyond the gate caught her attention. Looking up, she saw Peter's wheelchair at the edge of the ornamental koi pond that had once been the indoor pool where he'd learned to swim as a child. After the accident, Hugo had had it partially filled in, converted to a shallow decorative feature that ran along the back terrace. Peter rarely went near it. The sight of water seemed to trigger something painful in both Muller men. Rosa watched as Peter leaned forward in his wheelchair, reaching toward something in the water. With horror, she realized he was precariously balanced, the wheelchair's safety brake not properly engaged on the stone terrace. The next seconds unfolded in nightmarish slow motion. The wheelchair tipped forward. Peter's arms windmilled as he fought for balance. Then he was falling, splashing into the 3-foot deep water, the heavy wheelchair tumbling in after him. Rosa was on her feet and scaling the decorative gate before conscious thought could form. Years of caring for Peter had taught her the limitations of his body. He had some upper body strength but no control over his legs. In water, especially thrown unexpectedly, he would struggle to right himself. She heard Peter's panicked splashing as she raced across the manicured lawn. By the time she reached the pond, Peter had managed to push himself partially up, his head above water, but the weight of his legs and the disorientation had him flailing. "Peter!" she shouted, kicking off her shoes. "I'm coming!" She plunged into the water, ignoring the shock of cold, the pain in her lungs. Peter's eyes were wide with terror, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to keep his face above the surface. Rosa reached him in 3 desperate strokes, slipping an arm under his shoulders. "I've got you," she gasped. "I've got you." Peter clung to her, panic giving way to relief. "Mrs. Alvarez, I was trying to save the baby koi. It was stuck." "Shh. It's okay," she soothed, maneuvering them toward the shallow end where there were steps. Her lungs burned, each breath a knife thrust between her ribs. Black spots danced at the edges of her vision. With the last of her strength, Rosa pushed Peter onto the steps, where he could sit with his head well above water. The effort sent her into another coughing fit, this one so violent she couldn't catch her breath. She felt herself slipping under the surface, too exhausted to fight anymore. As consciousness began to fade, she was dimly aware of shouts, of hands, pulling her from the water, of Peter's voice high and frantic calling her name. Then darkness claimed her. Rosa awoke to the mechanical beeping of hospital monitors and the antiseptic smell of a private room. Her chest felt as though it were encased in cement, each breath shallow and painful. Through blurry vision, she made out a figure sitting beside her bed, tall, imposing, his posture rigid even in the uncomfortable hospital chair. Hugo Muller was watching her with an expression she had never seen before on his austere features. Was it concern? Guilt? She couldn't tell through the haze of medication. "Peter?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's fine," Hugo replied, his voice lacking its usual sharp edge. "Thanks to you." Rosa closed her eyes, relief washing through her. "Thank God. The doctors say you have advanced pneumonia, possibly tuberculosis. They're running tests." Hugo spoke clinically, but there was something else beneath his words. "You should have told me how serious it was." A weak laugh escaped her, triggering another painful cough. Would it have mattered? Hugo didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was uncharacteristically quiet. "You saved my son." "Of course I did." Rosa's eyelids were growing heavy again. "I love that boy." As she drifted back into unconsciousness, Rosa thought she felt a hand cover hers, a touch so hesitant, so foreign, that she must have imagined it. Hugo Muller didn't hold hands. Hugo Muller didn't show gratitude or remorse. But when she woke again hours later, he was still there, watching over her with eyes that held something she'd never seen before. Uncertainty. Hugo Muller had not missed a board meeting in 15 years. Yet today, he sat in a sterile hospital waiting room, his Italian leather shoes planted firmly on linoleum tiles, as his company's most important quarterly review proceeded without him. His phone vibrated relentlessly. Vincent, shareholders, project managers, all demanding explanations he couldn't provide. How could he explain what he himself didn't understand? How Rosa Alvarez, a woman he had fired, a woman whose illness he had treated as an inconvenience, had dragged herself back onto his property and into 3 feet of water to save his son. Mr. Muller, a doctor in blue scrubs, approached. clipboard in hand. We've stabilized Mrs. Alvarez, but her condition is serious. The infection has progressed to both lungs, and her oxygen levels remain dangerously low. Hugo stood, straightening his already impeccable tie. What's the recommended course of treatment? She needs prolonged hospitalization, aggressive antibiotic, therapy and possibly surgery to drain fluid from her lungs. The doctor hesitated. I understand she's your employee. Former employee, Hugo corrected automatically, then felt something uncomfortable twist in his stomach. What are her chances of recovery? With proper treatment? Reasonable, but she's severely weakened by working through this illness for so long. The doctor's expression grew stern. She should have been hospitalized weeks ago. The accusation in the doctor's tone was unmistakable. Hugo ignored it. And the cost of this treatment? Significant. Her insurance coverage is limited. Without additional resources, the doctor let the implication hang in the air. Hugo reached for his phone. Send all bills to my office. Vincent Hargrove will arrange everything. The doctor's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded. And her family, we should notify them. Her grandson is receiving treatment in Arizona for a blood disorder. Hugo paused, realizing how little he knew about the woman who had been in his home for 7 years. I'll have my assistant locate him. As the doctor walked away, Hugo felt a presence beside him. Peter had wheeled himself from Rosa's room, his face pale but determined. Is she going to be okay? Peter asked, his voice steady in a way that reminded Hugo painfully of Diane. The doctors are doing everything possible, Hugo replied, defaulting to the careful phrasing he'd used throughout Peter's own recovery. Peter's eyes, Diane's eyes, narrowed. That's not what I asked. The rebuke caught Hugo off guard. Peter rarely challenged him, had grown accustomed to accepting his father's measured responses. But now, something had shifted. Hugo saw it in the set of his son's jaw, the intensity of his gaze. Her condition is serious, Hugo admitted, but I've arranged for the best care. Because she saved me. Peter's voice was flat. If she hadn't been there, I would have drowned. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. If Rosa hadn't been sitting outside their gate, fired but still close by. Why was she even outside our house, Dad? Peter pressed. Why wasn't she at work? Hugo looked away. Her health had become a liability. I made a business decision. Business decision? Peter's voice rose. She's not a business, she's... He broke off, emotion choking his words. She's the only person in that house who actually sees me. The accusation struck Hugo like a physical blow. I see you every day. No, Peter said quietly. You see a problem to manage, a reminder of what you lost. Hugo started to protest, but the words died on his lips. When had he last truly looked at his son? Not as the heir to Muller developments, not as a schedule of medical appointments and tutoring sessions, but as Peter, the boy who'd once laughed so freely, who'd had Diane's passion for marine life, who'd been the center of their world. After Diane's passing, Hugo had channeled his grief into systems and structures, creating a framework rigid enough to hold back the chaos of emotion. Had he built those walls so high that his own son couldn't reach him? I see you, Peter, he said finally, his voice uncharacteristically rough. I've always seen you. Then why don't you know that I've been talking to Tyler about the accident for months? Peter's question was quiet, but devastating. Why don't you know that I found Mom's old research files? Hugo felt the blood drain from his face. What files? The ones about the mechanical faults in the Muller Tower parking structures. The ones that showed the same design flaw that caused our car to go through the barrier. Peter's voice was steady now, his eyes never leaving his father's face. The ones Vincent convinced you to bury after the accident. The hospital corridor seemed to constrict around Hugo. Those files were proprietary. How did you access them? A bitter smile touched Peter's lips. That's your first question, not whether they're true. Vincent's voice echoed in Hugo's memory from 9 years earlier. The structural issue is minor. Hugo, if we recall every garage now, we're looking at bankruptcy. The Muller name will be ruined. And Hugo, numb with grief, had signed the papers burying the evidence, authorizing quick, quiet remediation without public acknowledgement. "Those files are incomplete," Hugo said, the words hollow even to his own ears. "I know. That's why I've been trying to find the complete reports." Peter's gaze was unwavering. "I deserve to know why Mom died, why I can't walk, don't I?" Hugo sank back into the waiting room chair, the perfect posture he maintained as armor against. The world suddenly impossible to hold. There were structural concerns, minor ones. Vincent assured me they weren't the primary cause. But they were a cause. Peter's voice had lost its accusatory edge, replaced by a profound weariness. "You knew, and you did nothing." "I was trying to protect you, to secure your future," Hugo insisted. "If the company had gone under—" "I don't care about the company." Peter's shout echoed down the hospital corridor. "I would trade every building, every dollar for Mom back, for my legs back." The silence that followed was deafening. In it, Hugo heard the truth he'd been evading for 9 years. His choices had been about self-preservation, not protection, about maintaining control when everything else had spiraled beyond it. "Mr. Muller," a nurse approached cautiously. "Mrs. Alvarez is asking for you." Hugo nodded, standing on legs that felt suddenly unsteady. He looked down at Peter, seeing him truly for the first time in years. "We'll talk more about this, I promise." Peter's expression was skeptical, but he nodded. "Tell her I'm okay. Tell her thank you." Rosa's hospital room was dimly lit, the beeping of monitors creating a rhythmic backdrop to her labored breathing. She looked small in the hospital bed, oxygen tubing looped beneath her nose, an IV dripping antibiotics into her arm. "Mr. Muller," she whispered as he approached, her voice raspy. Hugo stood awkwardly at her bedside, unaccustomed to this role reversal. For 7 years, Rosa had maintained his household while he maintained his distance. Now, seeing her vulnerability laid bare, he found himself without a script to follow. "The doctors say you'll recover with proper treatment," he said finally. "I've arranged to cover the medical expenses." Rosa smiled weakly. "Always so practical." "It's the least I can do after—" Hugo trailed off, unable to complete the sentence. "After firing me right when I needed the job most?" Rosa's directness was unexpected, though her tone held no bitterness. "Or after I saved Peter from drowning in the pond where his mother taught him to swim?" Hugo winced. "Both." Rosa studied his face. "You drained that pool after the accident, filled it with concrete and fish. Why?" The question penetrated defenses built over 9 years of careful avoidance. "Diane loved that pool. She was teaching Peter to dive the weekend before." He stopped, composing himself. "It seemed fitting to transform it into something else, something that couldn't hurt anyone. But it still held water," Rosa observed quietly, "just enough to be dangerous." Like so many of his careful solutions, Hugo realized, superficial changes that left the underlying problems intact. "I've made arrangements for your grandson's care to continue," he said, redirecting the conversation to safer ground. "The specialist in Arizona will remain available to him." Tears welled in Rosa's eyes. "Thank you, Miguel is all I have left. Your dedication to him is admirable." The word felt inadequate, foreign on Hugo's tongue. "He's family," Rosa said, simply. "We sacrifice for family." Family. Hugo had built an empire to pass on to Peter, but had he sacrificed his relationship with his son in the process? The thought was deeply unsettling. "How did you know?" he asked suddenly. "About Peter at the pond? You'd already been escorted off the property." Rosa's expression softened. "I didn't leave. I couldn't bear to go without saying goodbye to him properly. I was sitting by the gate when I saw his wheelchair tip." The image struck Hugo with unexpected force. Rosa, ill and newly unemployed, keeping vigil outside his home out of love for his son. A love he had dismissed as unprofessional entanglement, interference in his carefully controlled world. "You could have left," he said, the realization dawning. "Anyone else would have." "No," Rosa contradicted gently, "not anyone who truly knew Peter." The implication hung in the air between them. Did Hugo truly know his own son anymore? The boy's words in the hallway suggested otherwise. He's been investigating the accident, Hugo admitted, surprised by his own candor, looking into mechanical failures in our parking structures that might have contributed. Rosa's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't seem shocked. He's been asking questions for months, about his mother, about what happened. And you knew? This? Of course, I'm the one who hears him crying at night. Rosa's gaze was steady despite her weakened state. Children need answers, Mr. Muller, even when those answers are painful. Hugo turned to look out the hospital window. Boston's skyline was visible in the distance, the Muller Tower prominent among the skyscrapers. His professional legacy, built on foundations that had begun to crack 9 years ago. Vincent advised me to keep the structural issues quiet, he said, the confession unexpected even to himself. To fix them without public acknowledgement, the company was in a vulnerable position. A recall would have bankrupted us. And what did that decision cost you? Rosa asked softly. Not in dollars, but in what matters? Hugo had no answer. For Dio, 9 years he had run from that question, burying it beneath spreadsheets and acquisitions and the rigid structure of days divided into 15-minute increments. I should let you rest, he said instead, retreating to the familiar territory of practicality. The doctors want to monitor you overnight. Rosa nodded, her eyelids growing heavy with medication. As Hugo turned to leave, her voice stopped him. Mr. Muller? Peter needs his father, not his CEO. The words followed Hugo down the corridor, through the hospital lobby, and into the autumn afternoon. For the first time in 9 years, he cancelled his remaining appointments, instructing Vincent to reschedule without explanation. Instead, he returned to Peter in the waiting room. Would you like to get some dinner? Just us. Peter looked up, surprise flashing across his features. You don't have meetings? Nothing that can't wait, Hugo replied, the words strange on his tongue. As they left the hospital together, Hugo's phone buzzed. Vincent's name flashed on the screen. For the first time in 15 years, Hugo Muller let a call from his executive assistant go to voicemail. The following morning found Hugo back at Rosa's bedside, a stack of folders under his arm. Peter sat nearby, watching his father with guarded curiosity. These are all the files on the structural issues in our parking facilities, Hugo explained, placing the folders on Rosa's tray table. Including the ones we kept confidential. Rosa's eyes widened. Why are you showing me this? Because you were right. Hugo's voice was strained but determined. Peter deserves answers, and I need someone honest to help me give them to him. Rosa began to leaf through the documents, Hugo's phone rang. Vincent again, more urgent this time. With a deep breath, Hugo answered. Muller. Vincent's voice was tightly controlled. Hugo, the board is demanding an explanation for your absence. And there's something else. A reporter from the Globe has been asking questions about structural failures in our parking facilities. Peter's online friend Tyler, his father, is an investigative journalist. Hugo felt the room tilt slightly. His gaze moved to Peter, who was studying the architectural drawings with intense focus. The son he had tried to protect by building walls of silence was dismantling those walls himself, brick by carefully laid brick. Handle the board, Vincent, Hugo said finally. Tell them I'm dealing with a family emergency. And the reporter? Hugo paused, 9 years of careful maneuvering hanging in the balance. Then he looked at Rosa, at her honest eyes watching him expectantly, and at Peter, his son, Diane's son, waiting to see what kind of man his father truly was. Tell him I'll provide a full statement tomorrow, Hugo said, his voice steady despite the seismic shift occurring within him, including documentation of all structural remediation completed since the Muller-Taylor incident 9 years ago. Vincent's sharp intake of breath was audible even through the phone. Hugo, you can't be serious. The liability alone would... It's already done, Vincent. Hugo cut him off. The choice was made the moment we decided to keep it quiet. He ended the call and turned to find Peter staring at him, eyes wide with disbelief. "Dad?" Peter's voice was uncertain. "What are you doing?" Hugo pulled a chair, close to his son's wheelchair. "What I should have done 9 years ago. The truth may cost us the company, Peter, but hiding it—" He swallowed hard. "Hiding it cost us something much more valuable." For the first time in nearly a decade, Hugo Muller reached for his son's hand, and Peter, after a moment's hesitation, took it. Outside the window, rain began to fall on Boston, washing the city clean. The Muller Development's boardroom had never felt so suffocating. Hugo sat at the head of the gleaming mahogany table, surrounded by 14 board members, whose expressions ranged from concern to barely concealed fury. "You've jeopardized everything we've built." Lawrence Whitman, the senior-most board member, slammed his palm against the table. "Voluntary disclosure of structural issues that were remediated years ago. The stock has already dropped 12 points since your announcement." Hugo remained uncharacteristically calm. "The disclosure was inevitable. My son had already discovered partial documentation." "Your son?" Another board member scoffed. "Since when do we make corporate decisions based on a teenager's amateur sleuthing?" Vincent sat silently at Hugo's right, his usual position of support now tinged with betrayal. He had been with Hugo since the beginning, had helped build Muller. Developments from a speculative venture into a real estate empire. He had also been the architect of the cover-up. "The structural flaw that killed my wife and paralyzed my son was present in 17 of our properties," Hugo said evenly, sliding printed reports across the table. "We addressed it quietly, without notifying residents or acknowledging liability." "As was legally advised at the time," Vincent interjected. "Legal, perhaps, but not right." Hugo stood, buttoning his suit jacket with the precision that had become his signature. "I've instructed our legal team to establish a compensation fund for any affected parties." The room erupted into chaos. Arguments about fiduciary responsibility, shareholder obligations, the statute of limitations. Hugo let the storm rage around him, his mind elsewhere. For the past 2 weeks, as Rosa had slowly recovered in the hospital, Hugo had experienced an unexpected transformation. The rigid framework that had governed his existence since Diane's passing had begun to crack, allowing emotions long suppressed to seep through: guilt, regret, and something else he couldn't quite name when he sat beside Rosa's bed, watching her patient interactions with Peter. "This is corporate suicide," Whitman finally declared, bringing Hugo's attention back to the boardroom. "We'll call for a vote of no confidence." Hugo nodded, having anticipated this moment. "That's your prerogative, but before you vote, you should know that I've already transferred a controlling interest in my shares to the newly established Muller Family Trust." He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a folder, effective as of this morning. Vincent's head snapped up. "What trust? There was no documentation." "I had it drawn up independently," Hugo replied. "The trustees are myself and Peter Muller." The room fell silent. Hugo had outmaneuvered them, ensuring that even a unanimous board vote couldn't wrest control from him. "The company will weather this," Hugo continued. "Our financials are strong enough to absorb the compensation fund and any litigation that may arise. And in the long term, transparency will rebuild trust in ways that matter." As he gathered his materials to leave, Hugo felt lighter than he had in years. The empire he had built might shrink, might even crumble, but for the first time that possibility didn't terrify him. Outside the Muller Tower, autumn had painted Boston in shades of amber and crimson. Hugo's driver waited at the curb, but instead of sliding into the back seat as usual, Hugo paused. "Take the afternoon off, James," he said, surprising his longtime driver. "I'll walk." The 3 miles from downtown to Beacon Hill gave Hugo time to think, to feel the city around him rather than merely occupying space within it. He passed cafes where couples lingered over coffee, parks where children played, ordinary lives being lived without the weight he had carried for so long. By the time he reached the hospital, his decision was made. Rosa was sitting up when he arrived, color finally returning to her cheeks. Peter was there too, reading aloud from a marine biology textbook while Rosa knitted, a skill Hugo hadn't known she possessed. "Dad," Peter said, surprised, "I thought you had board meetings all afternoon." "They ended early," Hugo replied, setting down his briefcase. "Rosa, how are you feeling?" "Better each day," she smiled, her eyes assessing him with the perception that had always made him slightly uncomfortable. "You look different, Mr. Muller." Hugo loosened his tie slightly. "I've had some time to reconsider certain priorities." Peter exchanged a glance with Rosa, their easy familiarity another reminder of what Hugo had missed by keeping himself distant. "Dad made a public statement about the parking structure defects," Peter explained to Rosa. "It's all over the news." Rosa's expression softened. "That must have been difficult." "Less difficult than living with it," Hugo admitted. He turned to Peter. "I've been thinking about your interest in adaptive swimming." Peter's eyebrows rose. "Really?" "I've spoken with a coach who specializes in rehabilitation through aquatic therapy. He's willing to come to the house, if you're still interested." Peter's face lit up in a way Hugo hadn't seen in years. "Seriously, that would be— yes, definitely." "Good." Hugo nodded, pleased. "And I've been considering changes to the house as well. The East Wing has better accessibility potential than your current bedroom. We could convert it into a more independent living space for you." "Like an apartment?" Peter asked, his expression cautiously hopeful. "Something like that. You're 16. Now you deserve some autonomy." Hugo cleared his throat. "And I thought perhaps we might restore the indoor pool properly, for your therapy." The significance of this wasn't lost on either Peter or Rosa. The pool where Diane had taught Peter to swim, that Hugo had partially filled and converted after, the accident had become a symbol of all they had lost. Restoring it would mean confronting memories long buried. "I'd like that," Peter said quietly. "Mom would like it too." Hugo nodded, emotion threatening to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. He turned to Rosa. "There's something else. The doctors say you'll be discharged next week." Rosa's hands stilled on her knitting. "Yes, though I'll need continued treatment." "I've arranged for a specialist to oversee your care," Hugo said, "and I'd like to offer you a new position." "A position?" Rosa looked puzzled. "Household manager," Hugo clarified. "With a substantial increase in salary, comprehensive health benefits, and accommodations in the gardener's cottage, which will renovate to suit your needs." Rosa's expression was unreadable. "Mr. Muller, is this because I saved Peter? Because— You don't owe me—" "It's not about obligation," Hugo interrupted, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "It's about recognizing what's important. Peter needs you, and I—" He hesitated, unused to such directness. "I've come to value your perspective." Peter looked between them, hope dawning on his face. "Say yes, Mrs. Alvarez, please. The house isn't home without you." Rosa's eyes filled with tears. "And my grandson, Miguel. Once he's well enough to travel, there's plenty of room for him at the cottage," Hugo said. "Boston Children's Hospital has an excellent hematology department that can continue his treatment." Rosa pressed a hand to her mouth, overwhelmed. After a moment, she composed herself. "I accept, Mr. Muller. Thank you." Hugo nodded, an unfamiliar warmth spreading through his chest. "Good, that's good." The three of them sat in comfortable silence until Peter spoke up. "There's something else you should know, Dad. About Vincent." Hugo tensed slightly. "What?" "About him?" "I think he's been going through my computer," Peter said, "ever since I started looking into the accident. And last week, when you were meeting with the lawyers, he came to the house asking strange questions about what we'd found." Hugo's mind raced. Vincent had been unusually defensive in recent meetings, had argued vehemently against the public disclosure. Was it possible he had more to hide than Hugo knew? "What kind of questions?" Hugo asked carefully. "About Mum's original files. About whether I'd seen any reports with her signature specifically." Peter frowned. He seemed really concerned about documents from the week before the accident. Rosa nodded. "He was quite insistent. I told him Peter wasn't to be disturbed, but he seemed desperate." A cold suspicion formed in Hugo's mind. The week before the accident, Diane had been reviewing the final safety inspections for the Moolah Tower garage personally. She was thorough, noticed things others missed, like structural defects in the support systems. Peter asked quietly. Yes, Hugo admitted. She'd flagged several issues for immediate remediation. I was overseas when she sent the report. He paused, a realization dawning. Vincent was supposed to implement her recommended changes immediately. But he didn't, Peter concluded, because it would have delayed the opening and cost millions. Hugo felt suddenly ill. Had Vincent deliberately delayed safety improvements that might have prevented the accident? Had his trusted right-hand man's negligence cost Diane her life and Peter his mobility? I need to see those original reports, Hugo said, his voice tight. All of them. I have some in my computer, Peter offered, but not the originals with Mom's signature. Those would be in the executive archive, Hugo mused. Vincent has been unusually protective of those files since the accident. The pieces were falling into place, revealing a picture far darker than Hugo had imagined. Not just a cover-up after the fact, but potentially active negligence beforehand. What will you do? Rosa asked softly. Hugo looked between her and Peter, these two people who had somehow become the center of his world when he wasn't looking. Whatever it takes to get to the truth. Vincent has been more than an employee. He's been like family. But if he deliberately endangered people's lives, the word family hung in the air. Hugo had used it automatically, but now found himself reconsidering its meaning. Vincent had been a constant presence, yes, but had he ever shown the genuine care that Rosa extended to Peter? The selflessness she'd demonstrated by risking her life to save him? You know, Peter said suddenly, Tyler's dad, the journalist, he says the most powerful stories are the ones where people find the courage to face themselves honestly. He looked at his father with new respect. Not many people can do that. Hugo felt a tightness in his throat. I'm still learning. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, Peter's upcoming tests, Rosa's knitting project, a sweater for Miguel, plans for the house renovations. For the first time in 9 years, Hugo found himself fully present, engaged without constantly checking the time or his phone. As visiting hours came to an end, Hugo stood to leave. I'll see you both tomorrow. Mr. Moeller, Rosa called as he reached the door. Have you been back to the koi pond since the accident? Hugo paused. No. Perhaps it's time, she suggested gently. That evening, Hugo stood alone at the edge of the ornamental pond that had once been the family pool. Dusk cast long shadows across the terrace, the water's surface reflecting the fading light in shimmering patterns. 9 years ago, he had ordered this space transformed, unable to bear the sight of the pool where his family had spent countless happy hours. He had believed that by changing its form, he could somehow contain his grief, control the pain as he controlled everything else in his life. Yet, water remained water. The koi glided beneath the surface, oblivious to the significance humans placed on this space. They simply existed, adapted to their environment, found beauty where they were. Hugo knelt at the pond's edge, trailing his fingers through the cool water. For the first time since the accident, he allowed himself to remember Diane's laughter as she taught Peter to float, the boy's triumphant grin when he swam his first lap unassisted. The memories didn't destroy him as he had feared. They washed over him like the water itself, painful but cleansing. As the first stars appeared overhead, Hugo Muller made a decision. The pond would become a pool again, not to erase the past, but to honor it, to create something new that acknowledged what had been lost while making space for what remained, much like the man he was becoming. 5 months later, sunlight streamed through the glass ceiling of the newly restored indoor pool. The space had been transformed, accessibility features integrated seamlessly into the elegant design, the latest therapeutic equipment installed alongside comfortable seating areas. Peter sliced through the water with strong, confident strokes, his adaptive swimming instructor calling encouragement from the side. Rosa sat nearby with Miguel, her grandson now well enough to join her in Boston, his health improving under the care of specialists Hugo had personally selected. Hugo watched from the doorway, taking in the scene, The board had eventually accepted his leadership, though several members had resigned in protest. Vincent had been dismissed after the full extent of his negligence came to light, the evidence damning enough to warrant a criminal investigation. Mueller Developments had weathered the crisis. The stock had recovered, though not to its previous highs. The company was smaller now, more focused on sustainable, safe development than on rapid expansion. Hugo found he preferred it that way. "Are you going to join us, or just stand there?" "Looking important," Rosa called, spotting him in the doorway. Hugo smiled, something that came more easily these days. "I didn't bring my suit." "There's one in the changing room," Peter said, pausing at the pool's edge. "We got your size from your tailor." Hugo raised an eyebrow. "You two planned this?" Rosa and Peter exchanged conspiratorial glances. "Maybe." Peter grinned. 10 minutes later, Hugo Muller, billionaire developer, corporate titan, and now simply a father, dove into the water that had once symbolized all his fears. The coolness enveloped him, a sensation both foreign and achingly familiar. Peter swam up beside him, his upper body strength impressive after months of therapy. "Race you to the other end?" "You're on," Hugo replied, and father and son cut through the water side by side, not racing so much as moving forward together, toward whatever waited on the opposite shore. From her chair, Rosa watched them with a quiet smile. The mansion still stood imposing as ever. The Mueller name still carried weight in Boston's highest circles, but within these walls something had fundamentally changed. Water had threatened to take Peter's life that autumn day by the koi pond. Instead, it had given all of them something unexpected, a second chance, a revival. Not perfection, but truth. Not isolation, but connection. Not an empire of stone and glass, but something far more valuable, a family. As Hugo and Peter reached the far end of the pool, their laughter echoed off the water's surface, the most beautiful sound in a home that had been silent for far too long. Dear listeners, we hope you've been moved by Hugo, Peter, and Rosa's journey of healing and transformation. Sometimes the strongest foundations are built not from concrete and steel, but from honesty, compassion, and second chances. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel for more emotionally powerful narratives that explore the complexity of human relationships. Hit the like button if you believe in the power of redemption, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Life, like water, finds its way through even the hardest barriers, and we'd love to hear about the moments that changed your own path.